Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. We're going to explore ways to sharpen our diagnostic skills, find learning resources, and hear from experts in the automotive field. Hey, what's going on, automotive world? Welcome to another episode of the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tipping, and I'll be your host once again for this week's episode. You got just me this week. What I'm going to be talking about this week is some vehicles that I've run into lately, and I guess I actually seem to run into quite often doing what I do, mobile diagnostics, where I reach a point in my testing when I'm trying to diagnose a problem, and I basically hit a wall for one reason or another. And usually this ends up being a limit in my testing abilities, sometimes the tools available to me to test, or my knowledge to interpret the test results that I'm getting in order to pinpoint a fault, right? So what I'm saying here is when I'm trying to diagnose something, I want to give the shop the exact answer, right? I want to tell them this is the part you replace and it will fix your problem. Pay me my money. I'll see you later. But I run into a lot of situations, and I think a lot of us do as technicians as well, trying to do this on complex vehicles nowadays, where we've exhausted our test methods that we have available to us. But, we may be close, but we're not able to pinpoint an exact component that is the cause of the problem. Now, quite often, this involves control modules on vehicles, right? It's a very common thing to do a diagnosis with a system that has a control module involved or multiple control modules involved. And again, dialing into the exact problem here, it can be difficult. When we're dealing with data transfer between two modules, that becomes a very common one where we know the system, we know the components, we know generally how it works. We know there's data transfer over a network like a CAN line, and we know there's a problem. We can identify, okay, this is the code that's setting, but when it's between two modules, sometimes, and this isn't always the case, sometimes it's definitely doable, but sometimes you're really not able to dial in any further to say, yes, this is definitely the problem in this module. This is what you need to do to fix it. Let me give you a quick example here. Ford Fusion, multiple modules on a Ford Fusion. The two in question are the anti-lock brake controller and the power steering control module. Okay, so we've got those two modules. Now, in the ABS, there is a code for a missing or invalid message from the power steering control module. Okay, and this is causing a light, and it's a hard fault. Clear it, comes right back. Missing message from power steering control module. Okay, I can talk to the power steering control module with my scan tool. There are no codes in there. I can obviously talk to the ABS control module, and there are no other codes in there. Just the missing invalid message from the power steering control module. Both systems seem to be functioning properly. There doesn't seem to be any issues with the power steering. I read the code data, and basically it says exactly what the definition of the code says, is that the anti-lock brake controller is looking for specific messages from the power steering control module, probably like steering angle, but there could be others, right? And I don't know all the details. The code doesn't list this out. It doesn't say, here are the exact messages that it's looking for. Now, side note on that, you can actually go into Ford service information, and it breaks down all of the messages over a CAN network, the broadcasting module and the receiving module. So that's cool and awesome that I can look that up. But again, the code doesn't pertain to the exact message that's missing. Now, here's the other problem. Even if I knew what the message was, I might not be able to decipher whether it's there or not. Okay. The data PIDs here were relatively useless to me. There was a few data PIDs that stood out as, okay, this is information that's shared between the two modules, again, like steering angle, but there's other things that aren't even shown within the data PIDs of the scan tool, right? And the data PIDs of the scan tool is what's translating the CAN bus messages and the module information to us. So I can't really use data PIDs. The information on the code basically says replace the modules until it's fixed, right? Replace the, I don't remember which one it said first. I'd replace the ABS module. Okay, if that doesn't fix it, replace the power steering module. Okay. That's basically where it led you to. And again, I'm kind of up against it with my testing. Do I pull out my scope and try to decipher CAN bus messages here? I mean, that's going to be me personally, for my amount of knowledge that I have, that's going to take me forever, and it might not even lead me to an answer. It'd be cool if you could do that, but it's not feasible for me in the moment when I'm at the car. Now, what I ended up doing with this one is I tried programming the modules. And when I did the ABS module, I programmed it, or reprogrammed it, I should say. And after that, the code went away. So this was a software issue, right? And just an example of that's something nice to try if you have a module issue, is to, update the software to see if that's a potential issue that's causing it. But that was a guess, right? And I was just lucky that it ended up being the fix. But I was just guessing. I didn't have any real hard data to tell me that this is a software issue. It's just, okay, well, we got to try this. And I have the ability to do that because I have Ford programming software. But if you're in an independent shop that doesn't do programming, well, now that's a cost to either you or the customer, depending on if you get it right, in order to try something to see if it works, right? And that's the example just I wanted to use to illustrate what I'm talking about here, because I run into issues like this, and the software programming part, okay, I can try that and it's not a big cost to me, but part replacement is where it's tough for me in the mobile world, right? Because if I tell them it needs this part and it doesn't, I'm going to eat that, right? That's part of what I offer to the customers, is I'm going to give you the correct answer, and then you can, get the car fixed and move on with your life. So if I tell them it needs this module, they replace it, it doesn't fix it, okay, well, I'm on the hook in one way or another. So what do we do at this point? Do we dive in and spend, hours and hours of testing in situations like this? Maybe a lot of the time it's ones that we haven't experienced before, so we don't really know what the outcome is going to be. You don't know the common failures of this system. You haven't seen it before. You've utilized your outside resources as well, right? Service bulletins, information that's out there on various websites, networks of friends. You've exhausted those resources, and you kind of have a unique problem that you're not able to find anywhere else. Okay, what do I do at this point now? Do I spend those hours and hours of testing? Potentially, right? And I can only say that because I've done it. I've spent hours testing something to try to get a pinpoint answer in a complex scenario. Or do you weigh it against the cost of the part that you're replacing? And so this was something that was, crossing my mind this week on a particular vehicle we'll get to here. But it was an interesting thought, and I wanted to share it on the podcast, not only to share my ideas, but to get everyone else's ideas on this as well. Now, when we get into the testing in this scenario, I think a lot of the time, it ends up being a limitation with our knowledge or ability to assess the test method properly. And some good examples of that are, again, like I said, the network diagnosis, but also secondary ignition voltage or in-cylinder pressure transducers. That sort of thing, where we're assessing something in a very dynamic, changing state, can be very difficult to pinpoint exactly what the problem is. Now, with all three of those, there are technicians out there that can do this with great accuracy because they have a wealth of experience performing these tests on both broken and good cars. So they know exactly what to look for. People that come to mind, Jim Morton has all kinds of stuff with secondary ignition. He's excellent with it. He can pick out things that I'd never see. Brandon Steckler with the waveform analysis, right? We're saying, oh, okay, there's valve overlap, and you can see this roller that's a little bit worn down on this particular cylinder. I see that in the waveform. It's going to take me quite a while, or I might just breeze past that when I'm looking at the same test result. Or I've spoken with Mitch Minton on CAN bus analysis, where he's going to have not only the tooling, but the knowledge to decipher what's happening on a network between modules. I don't necessarily have that ability. Does that mean that I shouldn't go out and try to gain those abilities? Well, not necessarily, but I do have to weigh what makes the most sense for my time doing what I do. You know, should I be hooking up with a CAN bus sniffer to vehicles to try to decipher CAN bus messages? I don't know. I have one. I don't use it a ton. I have an in-cylinder pressure transducer, and of course I have a scope to look at secondary ignition, and I will. But again, I'm limited in my abilities to assess those. And that's what we usually find in these situations, right? Like we're doing the test. We're not just guessing. We've dialed in, like we know the system, or we know the components involved at least, and we've performed what tests we have available to us. And maybe the test we have available to us can give us the answer, but again, it's our limitation on the knowledge and the detail of the system. But with these complex things, again, like we're talking about here, data transfer between modules, this can be really, really challenging to get the answer right with just the test results and nothing else. So again, my question here is there a point where replacing a component is the right move here, instead of spending hours and hours trying to pinpoint the fault through testing? And I honestly see both sides of it. But let me give you a couple more examples of recent vehicles that I've had where this has been my exact problem and has made me consider, okay, is just putting a part in this thing, my best guess, my gut feeling based off of my testing, going to be the right move here for me? So we're going to start with the 2015 Jeep Grand Cherokee. The issue was the backup camera did not work, meaning that when you put it into reverse, the screen on the radio, which the screen did work, would flip to a black screen and you couldn't see anything. Now on the screen, it did say check entire surroundings at the top. So there was something there, but the rest of the screen was black. Okay. So the shop replaced the backup camera, ended up with the same problem. That's when they called me. Okay. And I verified this problem. You can put it in reverse. That happens every single time. All right. So new camera, same problem. So I'm going to dive into this and try to figure out what's wrong. I did find with the scan tool, there's a bidirectional control. You can turn it to the reverse camera function without actually putting the car in reverse, which is helpful for testing because otherwise you have to have it running in reverse. So anyways, I do that and I can begin my testing. Oh, I did scan it for codes. I didn't have any codes anywhere in the modules that are involved. And the modules that are involved here, of course, you've got the rear camera. The rear camera has a power, a ground, a LIN bus to the BCM, and then it has a signal and what's labeled as return circuit to the radio itself that's going to display the picture. There's also a ground shield that comes out of the radio that is wrapped around the signal and the return circuit. So that's what I'm dealing with. Power, ground, LIN bus, signal, return, and a ground shield. And so it's just a matter of checking everything that's there. I'm going to start at the component, the camera, and make sure, do we have power and ground to it? Do we have a LIN bus? Based on service information, the LIN bus is supposed to send a signal to the camera in order to activate and actually produce its signal for the radio to display. So check at the camera. We got power. We got ground. Easy enough to check. We got our LIN bus signal. Checked it with the U-scope. Now, I don't know what it's saying, but there is activity on the LIN bus. And before we even really dive in any further, perfect example. Is the signal that the BCM is sending out, or the message that the BCM is sending out there to tell the camera to do something. Well, I know there's something happening there. It looks like a clean square wave. What's the message inside? I don't know. I don't know how to decipher a LIN bus message. It's proprietary information to that specific manufacturer. How do I determine what's being said and what's not being said? And in the moment, I definitely can't. I just can say, yes, there is something happening on this LIN bus. Okay. What else can I check here? The signal wire and, again, the return circuit that go from the camera to the radio. So I'm going to use my U-scope here, and you can actually see camera signals. If you've never done this, and you look at a backup camera or one of the cameras on the mirror, it'll have a signal wire. And what I'm actually used to, and I'll get back to this, is the camera's just having one signal wire. This one has the signal wire and the return wire going to it. But you can take your U-scope or Pico or whatever scope you're using, and you can actually look at the voltages that are being output by a camera. And you can move your hand over the camera, basically black it out, and you can see those voltages change. So, there's a processor inside of whatever receiving module there is, the radio in this case, that's going to decipher these voltages and convert them into an image, which is pretty cool that can be done. But I can do a real basic test of, is the camera doing anything, by looking at the voltages and then waving my hand over it and to see, does it change with my hand? And you can hold your hand over there and it will be a steady signal, and then move your hand and you'll see it change. And again, it's not a 100% be-all test, but in this case, it's indicating to me on the signal wire, I've got some voltage coming out of there. Okay, what else can we do? I actually have a CCV TV tester. And what this allows me to do is connect to these signal wires, and this tester will show me a picture if the voltage on that circuit matches the protocol for these closed circuit TV signals. And I don't know all the details on these particular signals, but I do know this tester works well for the cameras that are used in vehicles. I've used it before. So I hook up my tester to this as well. And I've already kind of proved it with the U-scope, but I like to pull this thing out when I can just to see, okay, hey, I can see what's going on in this circuit. So you could go either way with this, and I think the one with the picture is probably more effective. But anyways, I hook up to it and I can see a signal on the signal wire. Now, I'm referencing ground because you actually connect up BNC leads to this tester in order to connect to the circuit. So if you imagine, the colored lead is going to be going to my signal wire, and the black part of the scope lead is going to be going to vehicle ground. And I do that and I can see a signal. Now, I tried going between the signal and the return, and I didn't get a picture. But again, I'm not 100% sure what this return signal is for on this one. I'm not used to seeing that on these camera circuits. Just usually one signal wire that I'm looking at, but there is a return. Okay, well, let's see if I have this signal further up, right? Because it don't seem to be getting anything to the radio. But let's go further up, and I look at the diagram, and there's several connectors between the rear hatch and the radio to get these circuits up there. The easiest one I found to get to was actually under the driver's side of the dash. You just pull down the hush panel, and there's a big connector, right there as soon as you pull it down. You don't have to move anything. You can get up there, and you can test the circuits at this point. And after that connector, they go up to the radio. So the next step would be pulling the radio, or depending on what I find, it may lead me back towards the hatch. But let's test there because it's super easy to do. So I do that, and again, my signal wire, I have a picture on it. I can see it using my TV tester. I can see the signal. Okay, so now I got to go to the radio. So I pull the radio out of the dash and have my circuits back there. Again, there's a ground shield wire, which did measure ground, and then I have my signal and I have my return. So I go and I measure, and again, I have my signal on my signal wire, and I can view it on the little camera screen, see it on the U-scope, whatever you want to do. It seems to be there. Okay, and there's nothing on the radio. So do we call a radio at this point? And honestly, maybe I should have just stopped here and done that, because everything's leading to that. Right, they already replaced the camera. But I have a habit especially doing what I do, of before I make a call, just thinking, is there anything else that could be causing this problem? I like to ask myself that because I've made some bad calls just by ignoring that thought and saying, oh, well, this makes the most sense. This is probably it. Let's go with this. I like to just think about what else could there be? What else could potentially be causing this issue that I haven't checked yet? Now, in this case, particular, this vehicle, it has a return circuit. And this is where I got into the weeds because I didn't understand exactly what this return circuit's purpose is or how it works. And I measured on the return circuit. I was kind of thinking, well, maybe it's like a ground, like a module ground. A lot of times you see a signal return listed in sensor circuits for a computer, and it's just a computer ground for a sensor. So I tested for ground and didn't have a ground. But what I actually ended up finding is that there was a signal on this wire as well. And it appeared to be identical to the voltages that were on the actual signal wire. And in fact, I took my TV tester and I could get a picture on both the return and the signal when I was referencing ground. And I wasn't sure if this was correct, if this was what it was supposed to be. And I looked through service information to see if it could dial me into what was supposed to be there. And the only thing that I really found was it did list the protocol that was, it's a NTSC-M format. That's the video format. And I Googled that and I looked into some info, but it was tough to get some actual definite, this is what you should see for voltage. But it does show this as being a twisted pair protocol. And so to me, with my knowledge, that kind of brings up CAN bus, right? So I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe there should be voltage on both of these, but nowhere do I find that specifically. And again, I can view a picture on both sides referencing ground, but if I go between the two, I don't see a picture. So now here's where my limitation is, because I don't know exactly how this circuit works normally, and I don't know exactly what the radio or the module's looking at or referencing to get a picture. Is it going between the two? Is there a potential? Is it going between the two like a CAN bus and looking for an actual differential? Because if I go between the two with my tester, I don't read anything. Is my tester set up to view the signal the exact same as the radio is? Again, this I don't know because my tester is not necessarily meant for automotive testing. It's worked well for me in the past, but again, I'm not used to the two circuits. Could these two wires be shorted to each other somewhere in the circuit? And that's why I'm seeing the same thing on both. And that's my problem, right? I don't know. I don't know if the radio references ground when it's looking at these or not. And I still don't, actually. I wasn't able to find detailed information on this one. But what I decided to do here, because I wasn't sure, was to unplug the radio and to ohm check between these two wires to see, are they shorted to each other? Okay. And I get 80 ohms when I ohm check between the radio unplugged between the return and the signal wire. So I don't know exactly what that 80 ohms is. Again, is this some sort of short, maybe like water in a connector or something like that? But it could be the camera too, because I left the camera plugged in. And actually doing the research that I did on the circuitry, that NTSC-M format, the terminating resistance of the camera was 70 ohms is what it listed in the documentation I found on Google. So what I did here is I went and I unplugged the camera and I went to OL on my ohm meter up at the radio, meaning that those wires are not shorted to each other and that the camera is plugged in and connected to the circuit. Okay, so new camera, I can view a signal on both wires, and I'm not sure if that's right. They seem to ohm check from front to back correctly. There's no opens or shorts or extra resistance. I don't know, maybe the 10 ohm difference, but I don't have enough information to say that for sure. In this case, at this point, I'm going to call a radio. Now, am I 100% sure on this? Is there something else that I could be missing? Possibly. Where's the limitation? My understanding of how that circuitry works. Now, I'm actually waiting to hear back from the shop. I don't know if they've replaced the radio already. I think those do have to be programmed. So I imagine I would have heard from them if that was the case. But again, don't know that for sure. But again, like I mentioned, I reached a limit in my testing abilities and my knowledge about the system. Now, on this one, could I do some more research and figure out, more detail on these circuits? Definitely, for sure. And I did a little bit of reading for this podcast and didn't exactly get the detailed information on the circuitry that I wanted. Well, what would be a better idea? How could I get this information? And in this case, for me personally, it's finding a known good. And so actually I've been waiting to run into another Jeep with the same camera signal, which shouldn't be too difficult, and just quick test to see, is it the same setup on something that's working, right? And if you have that ability, I mean, that is an incredibly powerful technique. I've always been jealous of dealer guys that could check a known good working vehicle with a scope or whatever you're doing and compare it to the broken one. I rarely have that option in the moment, but man, if you do, that's a really powerful way to do it. But I made a call here on the radio. I said, get a radio for this thing. And that was the decision I made in the moment. Maybe it's because I spent too much time digging into this anyways. I mean, it was over an hour that I was on this for sure. But that's the call that I made on this. All right, second vehicle, and this one's unsolved. And I actually did not give the shop something to replace on this one because I was very unsure on which component is most likely causing the issue. So this is a 2009 Nissan Altima. And hey, if anybody's got any bright ideas on this one, I'll definitely listen. But that's kind of the reason why I'm doing this episode. Now, first things first, this is an auction car, so that always makes things really interesting. But the shop replaced the steering column lock on this Altima, and they put a new one in there. And at least that's what they told me is a new, not a used, but a new steering lock in this. Now, the new steering locks I've seen before don't need to be programmed. They're plug and play, but I don't know. They're calling me, say it won't key up. I can't get this thing started. Will you come program this? Okay, I'll come check it out. So I go and I verify this. There's a key with it. It's a smart key system, so push button. This uses a slot in the dash. So that's kind of like your emergency key slot, but it's right there on the left side of the dash. And if your key has no battery, or when you're trying to register a key, you're going to insert the smart key into this slot, and it's going to allow the BCM to see the data from the key. So I do that. I put it in the slot, nothing. Have it in my pocket, nothing. It just says no key in the dash, no key on the dash. So there's some power, some stuff's happening, but I can't get this thing key up. Okay, so let's scan this for codes and see what we have. I have a B2191 in the BCM, and that's it. Now, I can't talk to all the modules because it won't actually power up, but the BCM is one that I can talk to, and it's 2191, which is difference of key. That's what the code definition says. Now, I look this up, and service info just says you need to register the key. Like, the key you're trying to use is not registered. Register the key. Okay, well, that's easy enough. I have a number of tools that will do some Nissan key registration. And I pulled out all of these tools, every single one that I own, in attempts to do this, and everyone gave me the same result. Basically, there's a point in the key registration with these Nissans where the tooling is supposed to trigger the BCM to turn on the dash or wake up or to activate the ignition relay, powers up the car, right? But whenever I got to that point in the key registration, again, this is the key that came with the vehicle. It was aftermarket. I don't know if I mentioned that. But every point I got to the point in the key registration where it's supposed to turn on the dash, it never did, and then the process would error out. And again, this is every tool that I own, locksmith-wise, and even console. I tried console on this, and it gave me the exact same response as all the other tools, and the dash would never power up. So I did start wondering, okay, this is an auction car. I pulled the emergency blade out of the key, and it worked in the door, so somebody cut this key to this car. But let me try one of my keys. I stock keys. I actually had one for this Nissan, and I verified, online that, okay, this is the FCC ID. This is the key that I'm supposed to have for this vehicle. I put that key in the slot, and again, same thing. Can't get that dash power up, can't complete the key registration. So at this point, I'm kind of wondering, okay, well, why did they replace the steering lock? Is there another issue? Let me plug in the old steering lock here, because they actually had it sitting on the floor and the panel was down in front of the steering column. So I unplugged the steering lock module, which is on the bottom of the column, and I plugged in the old one. I just want to see, is everything exactly the same with that one? Just curious, just kind of see what happens here. And I actually got some more codes in the BCM with the old one plugged in, and it was referring to the position of the steering lock was an issue. And there's 2 position circuits that toggle from 12 volts to 0, depending on the lock or unlocked state of the steering column lock. And the BCM was setting codes, hard faults, for these 2 circuits. And you can clear them and they come right back, clear them and they come right back. Okay, so clearly there is an issue with this steering lock that when I plug in the new one is not there. It doesn't set these codes anymore. And I think that's what the shop was going after. Legitimately, I would have done the same thing. Okay. So I guess we'll leave the steering lock alone for now. Again, I don't know exactly what has to be done. There is a process for registering a used steering column lock within the tooling that I have, which I tried doing, but again, it wouldn't let me proceed with that process. It just gave me an error message there too. So I talked to the shop and say, okay, hey, here's what I'm up against. Do you guys want me to dig into this? And they're like, yeah, if you can figure out what's going on, that would be awesome. Because I have a feeling it's going to be more than just some programming of a steering column lock. I feel like there's other issues going on here. Came from the auction, who knows? So what do I do next here? Of course, I have to understand how the system works, and the slot that the key goes into in the dash is in direct communication with the body control module. And there's basically 2 data lines that go between the 2, and one sends information to the slot, and then the other one is information back from the slot to the BCM. And when you put the key in there and you press the start button on the dash, the BCM should send a signal out to the slot. It should read the key by using a radio frequency. It's a short distance, just like the transponder chip and a blade key in your ignition, exactly the same. And then the slot should actually send information back to the BCM on a data line. And that's saying, hey, this is the key that's here. So I wanted to see, is this reading the key? So I put the key in the slot, and I put my key tool max with the ignition coil function on top of the slot. And I take my U-scope and I put it in the data line that's going back to the BCM. And then I hit my start button. And the key tool max registered that there's an ignition coil signal, and it even tells you the chip ID. It picks up the data that's being transferred out of the key and says ID 46, which is supposedly the correct chip for this car, for the smart key for this car. It registers it every time. So the slot is actually activating and communicating with the key, or it's triggering the key anyways. And on the data line that goes from the slot to the BCM, I have a data packet every time I hit that start button. So it's sending some information back to the BCM. Now, again, here's where I'm limited, because I don't know what that information says. I don't know. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it saying there's no key? I'm not really sure. But everything seems to be working there. But again, when I get to the point in the key programming process, the dash never lights up. So now I'm thinking, okay, what else could be causing this issue? I'm like, well, maybe the BCM can't power up the dash, right? Maybe there's a basic circuit problem, powers, grounds, whatever, and it's not able to do so. Okay, there's actually a bidirectional scan tool function in the BCM where you can activate the ignition relay. And I did that and everything turned on. It turned on the dash. And I actually tried jumping power to this circuit while running the key programming function. And I basically turned the ignition on and off manually with a jumper lead the same way that it would turn on and off during the key programming, and didn't work. Okay. But to me, this indicates the first part anyways, the bidirectional control, that the BCM has the ability to turn the ignition on. It's not a circuit problem there. But again, for whatever reason, it's not. And when that happens, it says no key detected. So it's like it's not observing that a key is present. And I tried a hard battery reset. I considered, maybe reprogramming the BCM. I didn't do that. I didn't run the programming on the BCM, but it was a thought. But I was also considering, okay, what else could be causing this issue, right? The key that I have says it's correct for this vehicle. It is an aftermarket key. The one they have for the car is an aftermarket key. Sometimes you got to get that OE key. I haven't experienced that on these Nissans, but it's possible. So I got to have that into consideration. Is there something wrong with the slot that's supposed to be measuring the key value and sending the information to the BCM? Is it sending the correct information? Is it really observing the key, right? It's triggering the key sending out a message. Key Tool Max picks that up, but it doesn't mean the slot is. Is it sending the right information back to the BCM? Right? I can see data packets on the LIN bus, but is it right? Is it correct? Is the BCM corrupt somehow, where it's getting information, but it is not, or is not able to move forward with the process the way it's supposed to? Any of those legitimately could be the problem, but I'm limited now in what else I can test to verify that. And a little bit of a sidebar here. I thought about this as I was making the notes for this podcast, so I didn't do it in real time, and maybe I'll go back and do this. I could take the Pico out because I was just using the U-scope. I could take the Pico out and look at the data packets coming out of the slot, number one with the original key, and then with my new key, and then with no key, and see what is the difference between the three, if any, right? Well, if it's the exact same message every time, okay, well, maybe the slot is screwed up. If it's different for all three, that would lead me to believe, like, okay, it's seeing a key, it's seeing a difference between the two keys, it's sending the different identifications, and it'd be nice if there was a scan tool data pit for this, but there's not. And okay, well, now the slot appears to be doing its thing. Now I just have to make a determination between, do I need like an OE correct key, or is this a BCM fault? So that was a test when I really sat down and thought about it. Why didn't I do that in the moment? Well, it was in the moment, and that particular test did not really come to me. Plus, dragging out the Pico is a decent amount of work. So now I've got to make a decision. This was Friday afternoon. It was the last appointment of the day. And I told the shop, hey, I'm going to research this over the weekend. I'll come back next week. Sometimes you come back to this stuff fresh and you figure it out right away. But I have to make a decision here on what to go with first. Now, I think I might do that test to see what data is out of the key slot. But beyond that, I'm pretty limited on what I can actually test in order to condemn a specific component. And I mean, I have a few handful of other tests, right, going to the BCM and verifying all of the powers and grounds. That was something I didn't do. But I didn't have an indicator to me to, really go to that point. But again, where's all this leave us? Is the whole reason for this discussion, and the reason I wanted to bring up these two cars is, well, maybe you can tell me what's wrong with the Nissan, but Is there a point where replacing a component makes more sense than continuing with potentially hours of diagnosis, right? The point where we've exhausted all of our other resources and we've done as much testing as we are able to do in the moment. Does it make more sense to maybe walk away from the car, research it, come back? Do we stay on the car for several hours until we work our way through? Or is there a point where it makes more sense to say, okay, let's try this component? And I was thinking about it, from a business standpoint, does it come down to a math equation, right? If I spend 2 hours on this thing, right? And let's just say it's the $350 for the labor involved to diagnose something, or I could replace a component and maybe the component costs $150. Well, even if I'm eating that component, I could replace 2 potential bad components and still be under what it would cost me in labor time. And again, what I'm looking at there is, well, if I'm here on this car, it's costing me X amount per hour, where I could be out making money on other cars. Now, of course, this goes into the argument of charging for your time appropriately. And if you listen to the discussion me, Matt, and Brian had on Matt's podcast, we talked a lot about this. Is like, this is an area almost, I think, where you're researching, you're learning as you go. Do you really charge for all of that time? And that's, again, a whole nother discussion. And I listen to that podcast. You can get our opinions. I'm of the camp myself is if it's taking me 2 extra hours because I don't understand the system or I'm able to interpret what's going on, I'm learning something, I can't necessarily charge for that time. Again, every situation is going to be unique and you can take it by case, but if we're charging for every time it takes us longer, well, I might as well just move slower. And that's not really the way I want to run my business. So again, if I'm there for extra amounts of time because I'm struggling with something, I'm not necessarily going to pass that on to the shop. My thought is, okay, I'll get my butt kicked here, but then the next one I will be able to assess quickly, and that's where I'll be able to make my money up. That's my feeling on that. So with that being said, again, well, now we look at it, okay, does it make more sense to put a component on this car, and then if I get it wrong, I'll eat the cost of it? Or to spend that extra time in the moment, figure it out, or as much as you can, and maybe you still hit a wall. That's the problem. Maybe you still hit a wall after 2 hours, and you got to guess anyways at a part. Well, here's the components involved. Let's try one of them and see what happens. And I really, really do see both sides of this. And I think I've leaned more towards really spending a lot of time to pinpoint everything in the past, but there may be a time where this makes more sense to throw a part at the thing. And I don't want to be a parts changer. That's not even really that's not the point of this podcast, is to say, hey, let's just be part changers. It's more efficient. But is it at a point, right? It goes back to the coil swap thing, right? It's way easier to swap a coil than to pull out the scope. Of course, there's the component of, are you going to learn as much from just swapping a component as to actually doing the testing and seeing what's going on? Definitely not. And is it acceptable practice when you're offering a professional diagnostic service? Well, that's where I'm going to leave it. And I invite your feedback on this topic because I think it is pretty interesting. And it was something that was on my mind this week. One thing I can say before I wrap up here is, if you do make the fix, if you do replace a component and it takes care of your issue, there's a point there where doing some testing after the fact can really benefit you in the future, right? Let's take a look and see, okay, this is what it looks like normal on this CAN bus waveform, on this LIN bus waveform, on this circuit, in this pressure transducer, whatever. What does normal look like? What does it look like when it's fixed? And then document that information. That's huge, right? So if you make a bad call, or heck, even if you make the right call, but you guessed, use that to your advantage and learn something about the system. I don't always have that option in mobile because I don't always see the car when it's fixed. I just have to document that, yeah, that part fixed it. Here's what I saw when it was bad. But I can take advantage of testing known goods and documenting things here. But documenting this stuff is huge. Having some resource that you can put information in to journal this stuff, I would strongly recommend it. And that is where we can take advantage on the back end of things. Like, figuring out the problem still might be tough, but once we get to the conclusion, okay, let's gather as much data about it as we can so we can use that in the future. Build up those libraries of known goods and information to make us as ready as possible. And then we can also share that with other people that, you can help them, they can help you, sort of thing. So that's all I got for this week. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for the feedback. Always appreciate it. With that out of the way, let's get out there and start fixing the world one car at a time.